Hello and welcome to all of you joining us for today's webinar on the practice, progress, and potential for private and civic land conservation in Africa. We are honored to have an excellent panel of speakers today and an audience joining from all over the world. Before we get started, just a brief overview of how this session will work. The webinar will begin shortly with introductory remarks, followed by presentations from our three speakers today. The presentations will be followed by a question and answer session. At any time during this webinar, you should type in your questions for the speakers using the Q&A function on your screen. And if your question is selected, the moderator will pose it to the panel on your behalf during the Q&A. Please don't use the chat function to send us your questions, although you should certainly use the chat box for comments, feedback, to see or share relevant links or resources, and to otherwise communicate with us and each other. Finally, as always, a recording of this webinar will be available on the website of the ILCN at landconservationnetwork.org within the next few days if you have colleagues who may be interested in this topic or if you would like to revisit any of the presentations. With that, I'll now turn it over to Jim Levitt, Director of the ILCN, and Kiragu Mwangi, ILCN Regional Representative for Africa, to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Chani. It's a pleasure to be here with our distinguished guests from Africa and attendees from Asia, North America, South America, and Europe. Right now, I think more people will be joining us as we go forward. It is really a wonderful thing to see how our friend Mike Kiragu Mwangi has organized a growing group of African conservation leaders in the civic and private sector into a group that is beginning to coalesce. Summer, we foresee a future in which there's a strong coalition and cohort of civic and private land conservation leaders across Africa who are exchanging best practices among themselves and in the broader community of the ILCN with conservationists on 6 continents. So welcome to you all. We are delighted to have you. And with that, Kiragu, I will pass the microphone to you. Kiragu, you're still muted. So while you're getting on, let me add that Kiragu is the ILCN regional representative and the founder of Earth Positive Consulting, which is doing consulting in the land conservation field across Africa, which suits him very well to the job of coordinating this activity for the ILCN in Africa. So Kiragu, now let me give you the microphone.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you, Chadney, for the intro as well. Honored to have the opportunity to bring together this distinguished panel of speakers today, and an opportunity to learn and share what is the good work of what's happening in Africa, but also to to provide a teaser of what's going on, because it's almost impossible to represent the whole continent in one session. We hope that this is going to be the first of 3 in a series of 3 webinars that will give us a reflection of the good work that is going on in Africa before we get to APAC. I am honored to have the opportunity to have interacted with the distinguished speakers today, and we'll be hearing from the context of what's happening in Southern Africa, as well as Eastern Africa. And then we will have a reflection of what's happening across in the landscape of fundraising and resource mobilization in the continent for land conservation. But I do hope that in the next conversations we'll have in May and in June, we will also have invited speakers from Central Africa, North Africa, and West Africa to give us a better sense of what's happening across the continent. Before I launch into inviting our guest speakers today, I would like to just set the context a little bit and give you a reflection of what I've learned in the last 1.5 years of representing ILCN's interests in Africa. But before I do that, I think it's always important to understand where we're coming from as a continent, and we can never divorce ourselves from the anthropological and cultural associations that we have in the continent. If I was to pose a question, what does salt, gold, ivory represent in the 21st century? I think one would say they're but perhaps some commodities, but not the most influential commodities in current situations, especially whilst we're on the brink of the third, or potentially a third world war. However, these were but a few select commodities that drove the wealth creation of the great kingdoms of Africa. And right from Aksum, Ghana, Songhai, the great Zimbabwe in the early 1st to the 16th century. And these were ancient kingdoms representing a suite of organized societies dating back to 500 current era, who were responsible for protecting, controlling large landscapes and coastlines in Africa before the arrival of Europeans to the continent. So to understand the context of current land policies in Africa, one must also reflect and cascade back to a time frame of pre-European arrival before the 17th century and across to the 18th and 19th century. This is when the continent was divided up and land divided up into spheres of influence. And this has continued. The land policies that were implemented then has continued to have an effect on how land is managed in the continent. So this webinar is first in 3 to help us unpack what has happened in the past, what's happening now, and where we are moving towards with the effects of what we're having in managing land for nature conservation and people. To manage land in Africa, one cannot distinguish it from engaging communities, as well as making sure that we cater for wildlife in the continent. So today we are going to hear from experts who have engaged national governments in Southern Africa, in East Africa, and they will share the unique role and value that civic and private land organizations have in adding value to private protected areas and also other. So I will say that the challenges that we have in nature conservation are huge in Africa. It's almost considered as a last frontier for land conservation, as well as exploration for extractive industries, as well as agriculture. And we have to balance all this in maintaining integrity of ecosystems in Africa. I'll pause there and would like to invite our first speaker, who is Maxi Louis. Maxi is the director of the Namibian Association of Community-Based Natural Resources Management Support Organizations, abbreviated as NASCO. Her background is in tourism and conservation. In 1995, she co-founded the Namibia Community-Based Tourism Association and was the director for 9 years. Maxi joined NASCO in 2005 as a secretariat coordinator. Her current activities include coordinating NASCO's 3 main thematic working groups and 9 nonprofit organizations, as well as researchers and consultants working in communications. She creates linkages with partners and decision makers, including parliamentarians, government ministers, and other stakeholders. Maxi's motto is to leave a legacy where people sustainably manage resources and where women make bigger contributions to conservation industry. Maxi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kiragu, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. I will quickly share my presentation. Just give me a minute. Thank you. Is it visible? Okay.
Yes, it looks great.
Thank you so much. So as I said, thank you so much for inviting me to the webinar. And just let me know if I'm over my 10 minutes. Sometimes one can get carried away. So I work, I'm from Namibia. I was born here and I also grew up here. So I got involved in conservation from a very early age. But my work mostly now is looking at conservation on a different landscape, which is what we call in Africa, I think it was just explained, that we have a history of land being divided from national parks into communal areas, into private land, and that's what I want to share in the next couple of minutes. So just to get started, as Kiragu indicated, we have a program in Namibia, and this program is driven by a legislation that allows our communities, which is land that is communal, which means that this is where African communities live together on a pieces of land. And some of this land was actually divided up by colonialism. For instance, my country is just 30 years old. So we just had independence in 1990. So we're a very young democracy. And so as part of that land, we created a program. That program is called the Community Natural Resource Program. And that program allows our communities to take part in some conservation activities. And part of that conservation activities is that they need to be legally registered from a governance point of view over natural resources. Wildlife is very key in terms of this activity that they are involved with, and also other natural resources such as forest and fish, depends where you are. Now we have around 86 of these registered conservancies. We call them conservancies. Conservancies is a group of communities that have organized themselves on a piece of land with their leadership, and that leadership normally is elected democratically by the members of the communities, but also led in conjunction with their traditional leadership, which is very important. So that's what we have, around 86, which we call wildlife conservancies, but some of them sometimes integrated with 43 community forests. Our country is a very contrasting country. So in some areas, there's really good forest. In other areas, there isn't much forest. It's semi-desert, and that makes the contrasting bit in terms of land very interesting. Over the years, as we have implemented this program, actually over probably 28 years, we have created through some tourism, both consumptive and non-consumptive tourism, some jobs for our communities to participate. This is just figures that I'm giving you for 2020 before COVID, where we had people that are full-time employed in terms of joint venture lodges, but we also have around 45 hunting concessions that are managed by these communities themselves. So in terms of numbers of people that are involved in the program as a whole, this is a vast country, 840,000 square kilometers, square kilometers, but then we have a population of around plus minus 233 residents that participate as part of this conservation program. And then to date, before COVID, because our biggest income comes from tourism, they were close to 96 million Namibian dollars. I think $1 US is around, to date, around 14 or 15 US dollars. So this is our local currency that I'm referring to. What has been the impacts in terms of this program over the years? Cash benefits that goes back directly to these communities because legally they're allowed to get direct cash benefits. Meat is a big it's a big protein for those ones that live, especially in the arid areas, because we are a semi-desert country. Employment in these areas, because there's not much in terms of agriculture, is very big. So we have around 700 what we call game guards. These are community guards that look after wildlife, and the conservancies actually fund their operations. They are not funded by government. They fund all those conservation activities themselves. And they contribute to socio-economic development within their areas. This includes schools and clinics and other activities. Depends on what the conservancy's needs are. And then, as I said, they cover the operational costs that just deals with conservation in that area. Human-wildlife conflict, because we deal with wildlife and very dangerous game, from predators to elephants, cause a lot of problems with these communities. So we have created a scheme for them to, I would not call it a compensation, but this is just to cover the cost and the losses of some of the the communities that have losses from predators, from livestock or crop damaged by wildlife such as elephants and so forth. And then, yeah, we have also just seen an increase in terms of wildlife populations since we started this project program years ago. This is just to just focus on the issues around land in terms of how much land that we have secured. I think there was a question that was posed in terms of, are we addressing issues around 30 by 30 that is being proposed now. In Namibia, we have around, just on communal land, which is community conservation projects, we cover around 180,000 square kilometers of land, and 59% of that is actually community conservation in different, we have it in different models that we are implementing on that piece of land. Communities or conservancies manage around 166,000 of that square kilometers, and that comprises around 20.2% of Namibia. So in overall, the community forest also, which is also another type of land where sometimes you don't have much wildlife, but they are having some forest, and sometimes it's a mixture. It contributes around 85, plus minus 85,000 square kilometers, which is around 84% of which overlaps with some of the conservancies, as I just alluded on. Now, I just want to explain quickly here. This is land. It's not a park. This is where people have mixed economy on this type of land. So they live with their livestock. They do conservation. There are areas that are set aside for either just community forest and are protected. There's no people living on these lands. And then sometimes there's also land that is set aside for wildlife. There's no people within this. And some of these lands can be very vast. So this is what we have in terms of Namibia and where I live, where this program is taking place. We also, I just wanted to give you a glimpse, since this also covers Southern Africa. We have another program of which we are part of. It's called Elevating the Voices, CBNRM Voices in Southern Africa. So this is these countries that you see here on the map, and we have a network of leaders in these countries where communities are involved in some form of being involved in conservation. So there are 9 countries, as you can see. This also includes Tanzania with they have a program called the WMAs, Wildlife Management Areas. And so we meet and we have programs that we coordinate together in those countries through their different for us as communities. This is just an indication in terms of also information that we are collecting from a Southern African level, from these 9 countries that we are participating with, looking at how much land is under conservation at the moment. And I must just also indicate that this is still work under progress, because countries such as South Africa and Angola are not yet, we don't actually have the figures now, but we know there's huge amounts of land of which communities are participating, trying to either in a form of protecting the areas or being involved in community conservation aspects. I am not so sure because, oops. But then I'll probably, Kiragu, await if there's any questions or any comments, because it's true what you're saying. This is a huge continent, and this just represents not even half of the continent of what I'm sharing in terms of Southern Africa. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Maxi. That's very insightful, and we'll come back to you in a moment after the other presenters have spoken. I would like to now invite Dickson to give us a reflection of what's been happening in Kenya. And I'll just introduce Dickson. Dickson Simiren Ole Kaelo is the founding and chief executive officer for Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, a position he has held for the last 9 years at a period of rapid growth and recognition of Kenya's wildlife conservancies as a viable strategy for addressing biodiversity loss and rural poverty reduction goals. Currently, the KWCA's membership includes 167 community and private conservancies covering 6.3 million acres with over 700,000 households involved. Dickson has a Master's of Philosophy degree in Wildlife Management and a Bachelor's of Science degree in Animal Production. He is a conservation ecologist with over 20 years of experience in designing models and practice solutions linking conservation and communities, rather community development. He has worked with various community groups around East Africa's Maasai lands in field of research, policy, institutional development, integrated rural resource management, and designing of conservation projects. During the last 10 years, he supported community conservancies around community conservation around the Masai Mara National Reserve, and Dickson's facilitated the formation of the first 6 community conservancies and securing 870 square kilometers of land for conservation in Masai Mara. Dickson also holds board membership at various organizations, as, for example, the Wildlife Research and Training Institute, Wildlife Clubs of Kenya, Kenya Wildlife Trust, Amboseli Ecosystem Trust, and Masai Mara Wildlife Conservancies Association. He's also chair of Greater Mara Management Company Limited and a trustee of Mara Naiboso Conservancy. Dickson has received global recognition. In 2018, he was nominated and was a finalist at the prestigious Task Award for Conservation in Africa. In 2012, he was co-winner of the Sustainable Science Award from the Ecological Society of America. And in 2008, was a winner of the EcoStrom Award. Dickson, karibu.
Asante sana, and thank you all for this opportunity for ILCN, allowing us to share the progress and the practice of conservation work in our respective countries. And I'm looking forward to join the next series of webinars. I'm sure it'll be quite inspiring to learn also what's happening across the continent, and especially also to join the partnership of Maxi, who's just shared her presentation on what's going on in Namibia. I'm shortly going to talk about the Kenyan Conservancy model and how it's enhancing community land management and land governance. And maybe to add into Kiragu's introduction, indeed, a lot of Africa rural communities are confronted by weak land rights, as opposed to those of privatized land in the more potential and urbanized environments, and also have a history of excluding local communities as protected areas were established that are really wildlife only, and in some cases, a history of eviction of local communities that lived there, and the fact that the benefit sharing models have, in many cases, worked against the local communities, as the communities really take on the cost while the benefit is accrued elsewhere. And so our model and what I'll be sharing is an attempt to address these challenges that confront land conservation in Africa. And next. So our organization was established about 9 years ago with the goal of being a catalyst for locally led land management using the Conservancy model. And we've borrowed a lot from what's happening in other places in countries, especially also working with Namibia. And our organization has 4 key pillars. We work to convene, to bring together these communities to share experiences. We work towards informing them on what is going on in the policy circles. We connect them with opportunities, and we represent them in various fora so that the voice of the communities that are generally far-flung located get to be heard at the policy level, both at the national and the county level basis. And so that's what our organization works to achieve. Next. So in terms of how do we bring about the impact, we wish as a body to see that the conservancies are thriving across the country, expanded to cover larger populations where populations of wildlife have been declining and where poverty indices have been on the downward trend. We believe that working with empowering these communities to entrench land management practices that safeguard the natural resources is really the strong way. And our approach is based on establishing strong regional associations. We have 12 different landscapes, and we build the capacity of these landscapes associations to bring together the conservancies and therefore then link what is going on in practice within the conservancies to the policies. And so we do a lot of work in advocacy and working with the government to realize enabling provisions in our policies, strategies, and plans that then encourage and incentivizes better land management within our rural communities. Next. So we've seen over the last few years, beginning in the early 1990s, when the first conservancies were established, they tended a lot to be established on private lands, as the green line shows you. But that was just the beginning, and the area and the private lands having slightly increased, but not markedly, as opposed to community lands, which are the line in red. And as you can see, after 2004, we've seen quite a spike and nearly an exponential growth in the number and the coverage of conservancies across the country. And again, in 2013, you also see a very huge shift in the number of conservancies that were established. And the figures, if I added the last 3 years, will be more or less the same trajectory has continued. And so the idea has been to expand areas and managed by the communities to protect the habitat and the dispersal area that wildlife from the protected areas, the reserves and the parks are able to disperse and migrate. Next. And especially you can see the areas marked in sort of orange and light orange. You can see the number of conservancies spreading across the countries, a lot in the central part of the country, in the southern landscape, also towards the coastline. You see that in 2016, we had by then marked around 119 conservancies. And in just the next few years, the number has increased to about 237. And there are about perhaps 40 more new conservancies that are under different stages of development. And all these conservancies range between those that are in private lands, in group land, where land is being aggregated, and also in community areas, and all of them are governed by community-led institutions that have a board, and they have really made up an objective to look after the natural resources, integrating livestock, wildlife in ways that benefit the local community. Next. Our work on policy, I just wanted to share two highlights. One of them is to improve on the enabling policy environment, our inclusion in the National Wildlife Policy, the Wildlife Act of 2013, and also the strategy really provided a pivotal point and a turnaround for the growth of these conservancies, with the conservancies being recognized in 2013. So unlike other African countries where the policy was first of all put in place, in Kenya, the policies came later. Practice, there was quite a number of 2 or so decades of experimentation, and then those were entrenched in the current policies. And so the practice has really been the driver of the policy. And therefore, instead of being top down, it's really been a bottom-up model. We've seen the government beginning to really support the conservancies. Just to show an example, in 2021, under the COVID recovery, $10 million was shared across the different conservancies to support the rangers network. And there are now a number of county governments that are developing county funds to provide capacity support and support development activities within these conservancies, because communities now are able to advocate and they're able to step up and really talk to the policy processes out of their own institutions. Next. Yeah, the second one is when it comes to land rights. I mentioned earlier that the private lands have always enjoyed stronger rights as opposed to rural communities. In Kenya, we have a law called the trust land and the group ranch, which generally provided a much weaker policy environment, and that has now changed, and we have a new policy that we've been working with, and the government has been able to endorse it. And the two things that are really important around these policies is the recognition of community land use plans and grazing plans, inclusion of women as full members of the conservancies, and the requirement that 2/3 of the benefits from these conservancies, rather threshold is required to avoid cases of elite capture. And this really provided and catalyzed the interest of majority of the members to really want to consider conservation as a beneficial land use. Next. Our work also revolves around developing the different tools regarding integrating conservancies and making them governable. Good governance and better management requires quite a lot of information. So we develop customized tools and make them available to our community, so that then practice is improving over time and of course progressively. Next. Yeah, and we see a future where really community-led land governance has a big role. One of the things that needs to be in place is better incentives, and that's what we kind of work on. We also intend to expand the conservancy model as per the 30 by 30. We are currently at 11%. We have a target over the next 10 or so years to include another 9% of the conservancies, including, of course, addressing governance challenges, improving effectiveness of management, diversify income generating activities, and more importantly, also ensuring that there is sustainable funding available to these communities that are getting into the conservancy model. Next. Yeah, so thank you for that. Those are the highlights that I wanted to share. Of course, the story is much more complicated than that, and we'll be happy to answer your questions when the time comes. Thank you. Back to Kiragu.
Thank you ever so much, Dickson. That's a very, very good presentation, and we really look forward to digging into the questions in a moment. Before I invite the next speaker, I'd like to just remind the audience that you can use a Q&A part of the Zoom rather fun webinar to raise your questions. Please share your questions as we listen to the conversations, and we will come to the Q&A after Kathleen's presentation. Thanks so much, Dickson. Let me take a moment now to introduce our next speaker, Kathleen Fitzgerald. Kathleen is a protected area specialist with extensive experience in integrated large landscape conservation and development programs in Africa and North America. Kathleen has created new protected area conserved areas, improved management and financial sustainability of protected and conserved areas, established collaborative management partnerships for protected area management in 6 countries in Africa, covering 14 million acres, and led community and climate resilience initiatives. Kathleen helped establish the first species impact bond, established RED+ projects, and worked on biodiversity offsets projects. More recently, Kathleen was a partner at Conservation Capital, a vice president at the Africa Wildlife Foundation, co-founder and executive director at the Northeast Wilderness Trust, and now works at the Pew Charitable Trust on project finance for permanence. Kathleen is a member of the World Commission on Protected Areas Advisory Group and a senior advisor at the Global Wildlife Programs at the World Bank. Kathleen, welcome.
Thanks, Kiragu. And I'm gonna try to share my screen. So if you can kindly let me know if this works. Good to go?
Yeah, we can
Great.
see it.
Thank you. And I want to thank Dickson and Maxi, both pioneers in community conservation, really just amazing work, blazing the trail across Africa and creating models for other continents. And I know that there are representatives from other continents here today. So thank you, Dickson and Maxi, for your incredible work. And Dickson and I did not coordinate, but his last slide was about diversifying revenue and increasing revenue. And that's what Kiragu has asked me to speak about. And so what I'd like to do in my 10 to 15 minutes is just highlight some of the innovation that's taking place across Africa. So I'm going to give you some bad news, but then I'm going to give you some good news. And I know that ILCN does a lot around innovative finance and conservation finance. And so there will be further sessions to really unpack a lot of these. And also in the lead up to APAC, there is a sustainable finance stream. I know Holly Dublin is here today and is working on this at APAC to really look at what are some of the innovative finance mechanisms that we can use to achieve 30 by 30 and also to sustain the conservation areas that exist today across the continent, and importantly, to incentivize the people that live with wildlife, because we all know if that does not take place, we will not have a conservation success story across the continent. So here's the bad news.
Kathleen, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Is it possible to expand the screen? We're only seeing a portion of the screen.
Is
if you've
it?
got a
Okay.
presentation mode. Okay.
How's that?
A bit better.
If you go into the view option, you may be able to make it full screen on your
It's a PDF.
full screen mode. It's under read mode. Yep. That looks great. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. This is probably not new information, but the bottom line is, as we speak about 30 by 30, and as we hear about some of the ambitious targets that Maxi and Dickson outlined, the question is, how do we finance this? How do we sustain this? And how do we properly incentivize conservation? As At the top of the slide here, you can see a paper that Peter Lindsay, myself, and others co-authored, and it looked at what we need financially to sustain conservation in Africa. We looked at about 240 protected areas using lions as a proxy for ecological health. And what we found was that 96% of the range countries have a major deficit, and only 10 to 20% have adequate funding. So that's our baseline for what we're starting with. And of course, this is not unique to Africa. In the middle of the slide, you can see an assessment that was done by the Paulson Institute. And what they found was globally, there's a $711 billion gap in biodiversity funding. And lastly, at the bottom of the slide, you can see a paper that was recently published, which looked at management effectiveness. So what does this all mean in terms of conservation performance? What it means is the funding gap is resulting in a lack of management and conservation performance. And what this paper found was over 80% of Africa's savanna conservation lands is not achieving its conservation objectives. So that's the bad news. We have a funding gap that's resulting in biodiversity loss and a lack of incentive for the communities that are living with wildlife. As Dickson and Maxi have alluded to, we have a number of conservation mechanisms that are used on private and community land to secure important habitats, to secure ecosystem services. And again, I think ILCN has profiled a number of these in previous sessions and in literature. So community conservancies, easements, leases, land use planning, and in some cases, land acquisition. And as Dickson said, whatever the tool we're using to secure land, the challenge Africa is facing is how do you increase and diversify funding? And of course, COVID just reemphasized this and hammered that point home. And so what I want to do is just highlight some of the innovative mechanisms that we are using across the continent. The first thing is, before we dive into what innovative finance models could be used on community lands or private land, the question is, how much money do you actually need? And this seems like a very basic question, but the majority of Africa's conservation areas, and when I say conservation or protected areas, I'm referring to IUCN 1 through 6, from private community to state land. The question is, how much money do you need? And a majority of our conservation areas in Africa can't answer that question. So the first thing that needs to happen are proper business plans for conservation areas. How much funding do we need to maintain conservation on community conservancies, for example, in Namibia? We need proper business plans for individual conservancies as well as networks. So for example, when KWCA is looking at increasing revenue, what do they need at a whole? And what do they need, for example, at a site level in Naibosho? And here are 3 steps used for conservation area business planning, but essentially it's, what are your targets? What are your goals? What are the actions you need to achieve those goals? And then what are the revenue opportunities in order to fulfill those funding needs? And it's a very simple thing, but I can't stress this enough. I know that Christine Menzel is here today as well. IUCN is going to be doing a conservation area business planning session at APAC, providing that training that communities, individuals, and protected area authorities need to answer these very basic but necessary questions. So once we figure out how much money you need, the next thing is creating the right enabling environment to develop these finance mechanisms. And both Maxi and Dickson alluded to the policy work that they're doing, which is absolutely critical. Policy work around creating the right enabling environment to develop finance models. So decentralizing rights over natural resources is critical. And one of the key things around developing finance mechanisms is who owns these natural resources, who owns the land, who owns natural resources, what is the policy that's in place that enables them to optimize different economic opportunities on those protected areas, conserved areas. And so as we go through the different mechanisms, understanding the enabling framework that is in place or needs to be in place is critical in terms of developing different sustainable finance mechanisms for conservation areas in Africa. The first tool I want to highlight in terms of an enabling framework is collaborative management partnerships. This is a toolkit that the Global Wildlife Program of the World Bank has developed. Its focus was on government protected areas, but it can be used, and it has been used, on private land and community lands. And this is one of the enabling frameworks that is being used across Africa. And it's been proven to stimulate investment in conservation areas. And that's why I'm highlighting this today. There's a lot to unpack here, and hopefully Kiragu will have a session on this in the future. But collaborative management partnership is essentially when a protected area authority, it can be government, it can be private, it can be a community, enters into a management agreement with a partner for the management of a protected area. So Dickson, for example, is the board chair of a company called Greater Mara Management, which Kiragu mentioned. And those community conservancies have engaged in a management partnership for the management of the conservancies. In South Africa, we've seen the Makaleki community in Northern Kruger enter into a collaborative management partnership with Sand Parks. There are lots of different models of collaborative management partnerships. They're not all the same. And again, there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to highlight the tool. I want to highlight that this is indeed a mechanism that's been used to secure management rights, which has stimulated investment in conservation management and sustainability. We did an analysis of 40 collaborative management partnerships, and what we found was an increase in ecological, economic, technical, and operational drivers. Across the board, we found an increase in revenue. We found an increase in community development. And I highlight here, for example, some of the other benefits that are very important, such as brand awareness for protected areas and countries. And this just gives you a snapshot. Again, the focus of the Global Wildlife Program Toolkit was looking at government protected areas. And as you can see, it's quite significant. More than 12% of the protected areas in Africa are using collaborative management partnerships. And so again, this is a tool that could be deployed across private and community lands to enhance management. And again, as we have found, it increases investment as well as operational funding. Second opportunity I want to profile is conservation enterprise. And conservation enterprise is something we define as a business that's developed to enhance community development as well as conservation. And like all of these, again, enabling environment is critical and structure is critical. And I'm going to give one example in Rwanda, which is where APAC is going to take place. And this is Sabino Silverback Lodge, which is just outside of Volcanoes National Park. It's wholly owned by the Sokola community, which is the community that lives in this area. And it's managed by a private sector partner. Again, it all comes down to conservation enterprises, how it's structured. And this is structured in a way to benefit the community. And over a 10-year period, the community generated $3.2 million. That money has been used to support community development, education, and resiliency. There's a lot of opportunities in terms of enhancing existing enterprises, in terms of developing new enterprises, and as Dickson alluded to, diversifying those opportunities. And this is something, again, that can be unpacked at a future session. The next one I want to highlight, and again, my goal here is just to give you an idea of the different funding opportunities that are taking place across the continent. Conservation trust funds. Many of you are aware of conservation trust funds, which are essentially private, legally independent, mission-driven institutions that are set up to sustain financing over a long period of time. And I think one of the key things about conservation trust funds in Mozambique, which Maxi probably knows a lot about, the conservation trust fund there, they often point out that having that fund for community and government protected area has enabled them to enhance innovative finance because they're not worried about how to pay the rangers or how to pay for basic management. It gives them the time and the flexibility to explore different innovative finance. And I think that's a really key point as we think about conservation trust fund development in Africa. The Conservation Finance Alliance, you can see their logo at the bottom of this page, has done really incredible work in analyzing conservation trust funds around the world. They did a 10-year review, which is on their website, which profiled the 108 conservation trust funds that now exist worldwide to look at how they're structured, what the trends are, and where the opportunities are. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in CTFs. Payment for ecosystem service is another option and something that's being developed across the continent. And as many of you know, payment for ecosystem service, essentially it occurs when a beneficiary or a user that uses an ecosystem service makes a direct or indirect payment to provide and to pay for that service that's provided. And you can see here on the slide the traditional model, right? When you have the upstream community stewards providing service, watershed protection for the downstream users. What we've seen in Africa on PES is significant development, and I want to highlight carbon, which is a growing trend, as very compelling and significant opportunity across the continent. Africa boasts having the first voluntary carbon project, which was developed in Kenya by Wildlife Works. Carbon Tanzania is another example, community-based conservation, community-based carbon development. Both of these examples engage and benefit communities in conservation and are generating revenue through carbon credits to support those community conservation areas. It's, as many of you know, it's growing globally, and it is a significant opportunity that should be pursued across the continent. I'm going to skip ahead because I know we have, I'm limited on time and I can get back to these. The last one I want to focus on, Kiragu, is biodiversity offsets. As everyone knows, Africa is developing significantly. And there is an opportunity to engage with corporates and to engage with private sector partners in biodiversity offsets using the mitigation hierarchy, which you can see here, but essentially looking at the impact and determining how to offset those impacts. And I'm going to give you one example. I know I'm going beyond the boundaries of East and Southern Africa, but this will be a highlight for a future West Africa session. This is one example, Niokolo-Koba National Park in Senegal, where a gold mine was developed outside of the protected area. And the gold mine offset its impact by investing in community development and protected area management. So biodiversity offsets are taking place across the continent. It does present an opportunity for community conservation as well as private land conservation. I'm short on time, and I hope that my goal, which was to really demonstrate the innovation that's taking place across the continent, I hope I achieved that. And really the task now is, how do we scale those up? How do we replicate that so we can not only achieve 30 by 30, but do so in a way that actually results in community benefits and management effectiveness? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That's brilliant. It's another demonstration of quite a lot of wonderful work that is ongoing in the continent, and the opportunity to hear from you and learn from you, as well as Dickson and Maxi on this. I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity that you've given us. I've got a question. I'll start with a series of questions. And once again, I want to encourage the participants to keep asking on the Q&A bit section. But I'll start off with a question that Jim has posed for all the panelists, and then I'll take a question from Laura Johnson. Jim asked the panelists to describe one or two of the most promising avenues of expanding the organizational capacity in Africa to address the gap in funding and landscape protection, and as well as perhaps how do these mechanisms lead to increase in measurable ecosystem services like carbon sequestration, biodiversity protection, water supply, securement, etc. So I'll start with that one. Feel free to jump in, or shall I suggest, Kathleen, do you want to respond to that first, or before we have the others jump in?
Sure, I'm rereading that.
Okay.
Expanding organizational capacity in Africa to address the gap. It's a great question. One of the things that we've been pushing for, Jim, is really supporting organizations like NACSO, like KWCA, in equipping the communities with the tools that they need, number one, to figure out how much funding they actually need. So that conservation area business planning, number one. Number two, organizations like KWCA, for example, are really looking at the enabling environment, looking at what policy framework needs to be in place in order for communities to develop these mechanisms. So I think those can be replicated and scaled. For example, Maxi mentioned the wildlife management areas in Tanzania. There is an association now looking at WMAs. How can WMAs, for example, how can we decentralize rights to those WMAs like we've done in Kenya and in Namibia, right? It's a different structure in Tanzania. So I do believe these associations play a very key role in supporting and equipping communities with the skills, with the tools that they need. And lastly, and I'll turn it over to Dickson and Maxi, how do these mechanisms lead to an increase in measurable ecosystem services? So I think what you're alluding to, Jim, is kind of the accounting and the valuation of those ecosystem services, which is obviously nascent at this stage. There are natural capital accounting systems that are being deployed in certain areas. Rwanda is a good example. They're doing natural capital accounting at a national scale. And so that is happening across the continent. The question is, how do you make that meaningful, for example, the Maasai and Naibosho, right? How do you take it from a national level and make that relevant to people living on the ground? At a project level, that's happening, right? So for example, Carbon Tanzania, they can tell you the exact amount of carbon that's been sequestered on an annual basis in the Ida Valley with that community. So we have these two different systems in terms of national as well as project level.
Thanks, Kathleen. Dickson, do you want to chime in, Max?
Yeah, I just wanted to. I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that will continue confronting us. And there are actually two parts to that question. One of them is capacity building, really building the capacity of those that are managing these areas to deliver. And also the other part of the question is addressing the funding gap. As Kathleen has demonstrated, there is a huge gap. And there will not be one solution to it. I think it requires a multiplicity of solutions. I think that increased funding by governments of especially the state protected areas is something that Africa has to achieve. And indeed, there are many issues that are confronting a lot of African governments to achieve with the limited resources. But I think that the continent needs to see a lot more national budgets assigned for protected areas, the national parks, the reserves, to make sure that they are not dependent on tourism income or just support from other sources. And the more that is achieved, I think it's the better. I think the role of international funders, particularly those that target funding to community organizations, is going to be a game changer. And I think we all have seen cases where the same amount of money, targeted to a community group that has received some capacity support could actually yield more outcomes, both social and economic, than otherwise. And so beginning to see more targeted funding to some of these community groups that are now organizing themselves. I think the partnership with tourism continues to be a major change maker. I think the COVID, of course, dealt a big blow on it, but tourism continues to be resilient. Tourism concessions and crisis funding, coupled with crisis funding, ability for these protected areas to make savings during the good time to secure their bad times are going to be really important. And I think, as Kathleen has mentioned, the role of carbon credits. These areas are generally large, and they have vegetation, and they have grasslands that are capturing a lot of carbon. And there is always the risk of this carbon being released through monoculture agriculture. And so the more the carbon credit funding becomes available to these land managers at scale and in a meaningful way, the more likely that they're even able to survive COVID. And I think, all the instruments that Kathleen have been sharing are going to be important in different areas at different times. So it's really unpacking what really works at one time. And I saw that Kathleen also had a slide on project finance for permanence. Not much was said, and I think that the future is going to be really about securing commitments over a long term to secure adequate resources, so that protected area managers are not spending all their time trying to fundraise, rather trying to achieve conservation and community outcomes on the ground.
Lovely, thank you. Maxi, do you have any?
I just want to thank you so much. I just want to thank you to Kathleen, because I think it's a really critical area that sometimes I think we tend not to address as we address issues around conservation in Africa. Maybe there was also a question that I saw on the chat around private game reserves, which is in Southern Africa. It's a big conservation program. For instance, in Namibia, we do have around 46% of land that is contributed, I think a little bit more than that now, to conservation, and most of it comes from the communal conservancies that I presented, but the others half actually comes from the the private game reserves. There's so much that is happening on those game reserves, but we don't really talk so much about it. I'm not a specialist to talk about it, but I think it's a critical area that I think in Southern Africa, and I've seen it in mostly Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa, where they in other Southern African countries where they're doing so much in terms of issues around conservation on those lands. But I wanted to just add on the issue of conservation trusts funds that in Namibia, we did the unconventional thing. I think we looked at the protected area trust fund in Kenya, and we said, can we replicate this on our communal conservation lands? And I think that was a big step to take, and we started this process of addressing sustainability already in 2012. As we started doing needs assessments, looking at gaps and on these vast pieces of lands and involving so much governance structures and stakeholders, we realized this is very complex. This is not as easy as we initially thought. And that's why it took us so many years. And it's just like 3 years ago that we managed to formalize a trust fund. But I must tell you, a trust fund where we still now need to campaign in terms of getting funds into the trust fund. So it is actually very complex and not as easy as we think in Africa. So, but it is doable. I think Mozambique and Madagascar, I think, is the two countries where we have learned from that we don't need to continuously run around looking for money for conservation if you have an activity such as that one. But I also want to add something around the issue of 30 by 30. When you look at Namibia, for instance, we have actually bypassed the 30 by 30. My question has always been, how do we define that 30 by 30? If the 30 by 30 is merely not defined by people that are doing conservation now already, we might even lose more than we initially had. So we should actually look at those communities, those localized people, those institutions, those governance structures that have set land aside in a different models to save and salvage what we have now and build on that, but also looking forward in expanding what we can expand. But I think for now, we really need to have a very clear definition in terms of what we mean by 30 by 30, but I think it's a very good.
Max, I don't know whether you can hear us, but your sound disappeared for a moment. But I think you've touched on what Laura Johnson was asking about private game reserves and their role, as well as OECMs. I could just chime in and say that we do hope that in the second series, second webinar, we'll have a presenter who will speak specifically to OECMs and their role in achieving that target of 30 by 30 and how IUCN is helping governments to work towards recognizing OECMs. But I think just before I pose the next question by a participant, I wanted to just touch on that point there around how do we create or increase the attractiveness of the privately protected areas in the space you're working in the continent. What are some of the key strategies that you've employed to make them become a lot more recognized by national governments? And how have you managed to make the business case to the governments to appreciate them as an addition or adding value to that target of 30 by 30, which is a national commitment to any government that signed up to CBD?
Maybe Kiragu, if I can go. I think first of all is on the question on the private game reserve. In Kenya, we have recognized land managed by private landowners and corporate bodies as part of our network. In essence, the Conservancy movement and the private land conservation are more or less one and the same. And I can't underscore more the importance of these private land areas, considering that majority of the land in Africa is privately owned. And so expanding the model in privately owned lands is really vital. There was also a question on conservation easements. In Kenya, we have just recently gotten recognition in law of conservation easements. It hasn't yet been applied, but I do believe that, especially as we think about longevity, sustainability, conservation easements are going to be really important. And it's really the incentive package that land under conservation would attract from government that remains sort of a bottleneck. And I'm very keen to explore that with our colleagues in ILCN on the kind of institutional and legal frameworks to encourage land under conservation easement. I think Kathleen has some good knowledge on that, but we've been discussing this back and forth that the longevity of what we are doing today will best be anchored through conservation easements. There was also a question on measuring effectiveness. I think that remains a big challenge. There are indeed large areas, but to what extent are they effective in both achieving conservation and development outcomes? And of course, these are always, there is always a tricky balance on these particular questions. And so, the IUCN has developed quite a number of tools for measuring effectiveness, and KWC, we've been piloting with some of our partners as IID on measuring effectiveness using SAGE methodology, IMET, and there are quite a number of others. And I think that this needs to be entrenched in both our business planning and also our conservation area management. And then lastly, the question on making conservation attractive and building a business case for government. Indeed, first of all, I think having national level grassroots focused organizations like KWCS, NACSO, the CWMSC, and Uganda are already coming up with Umoja Wildlife Conservancy of Uganda. So having these umbrella associations, both at the national level and at the local level is going to be key because for government influence, you need a critical mass and you need a coordinated message. And so these associations play an important role. And I can directly speak from what I've seen in Namibia and also in our country that, most of the advocacy, when done by a representative body of these communities, it does actually build a strong voice. And that's the voice that we need to entrench within the national processes by our organizations, associations like ourselves, participating in government planning fora and engaging with government and presenting data and information and facts about what really is going on. And especially if you couple these conservation outcomes, but also improvements of the life of the people that are being experienced, this is going to be really central. But I think the overarching role of international programs, for example, the CITES, the Africa Park Congress, the World Conservation Congress, CBD, getting this voice to those platforms is going to be relatively influential in really building the case for community-led conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dickson. I noticed that we're starting to run out of time. There was a question posed by someone anonymous about prevalence of conservation easement. May I request Kathleen to take this one on? How prevalent is the use of conservation easement in land conservation initiatives in Africa? What incentives, in terms of tax incentives, property tax reduction, exists for landowners to create conservation easements or other conservation arrangements in Africa? I turn to you, Kathleen, because I know you've got a background in facilitating some of this, and you may have much more broader scope, and then I would invite Maxi and Dickson to chime in after that.
I mean, the answer to the question, how prevalent is the use? Not very prevalent, to be honest. That's the short answer. As Dickson said, there's new conservation easement legal framework in Kenya. In Kenya, our early laws permitted easements, but the way it was structured, it was an enforced easement. So it wasn't voluntary, which was obviously something that as from a conservation standpoint, we never wanted to promote. And so the fact that it exists in the country now in Kenya is great. But the second part of the question is the most relevant is, well, what's the incentive? And that still hasn't been sorted, to be honest. I think South Africa, we know that South Africa, of course, they have really great tax incentives for stewardship and for easements. And so learning from South Africa, I think, is the best way to approach easements around Africa.
Well, that's a bit of a shocker for me that it's not as prevalent as I thought it was. But yeah, good answer. Thank you. Dickson, do you have a reflection on how this is working out in Kenya, given that there's the right enabling environment for it?
Yeah, I think just to agree with Kathleen that the incentive model has to be in place, and yeah, that's really what is lacking, and I think that's what we all need to work on to provide the kind of incentives that, especially to government, to incentivize voluntary easements rather than enforcing easements.
I think, Kiragu, the other thing just to consider, I know the North America easement model is perpetuity, right?
Correct.
The idea of perpetuity it is in some ways a foreign concept in Africa. So a lot of the communities that Dickson and Maxi work with are thinking about the next season.
Correct.
Getting a 15-year conservation lease is extraordinary and takes hours and hours and days and weeks and years of dialogue. So the question I would ask is, what's the added benefit of an easement that a conservation lease is not achieving? And that's what needs to be considered in terms of where it's applied and how it's applied.
So conservation leases more than easements. Is that your experience in Namibia, Maxi?
Yeah, I think Kathleen has said it on paper. I have seen it in Namibia. It's part of some policies, but when it actually comes to the reality on the ground, it's very complicated, it's very complex, and it's true, it takes years. And for those ones that have done it, I must tell you, it's an experience to go through. So it's not well, it's something that is not really at the moment very well accepted. And I actually thought it was just in Namibia, but it's interesting to say that it's all over Africa, that people just have exactly the same thing. So it is, I think there is the willingness to do it, but I think it's probably not an accepted norm at the moment. So we still have a long way to go.
Okay, so an area of capacity building to encourage players to understand the benefits of it. Great. Let me move on to a question by Phil Huffman. Are conservancies working together and with state protected areas, game reserves, etc., to establish well-connected networks of conserved lands across boundaries to achieve broader landscape scale conservation needs goals, such as wildlife and habitat movement in response to climate change? And are there key needs or opportunities for helping foster more of that collaboration across geographic, political, and organizational boundaries?
Yeah, can I start with that, and then
Sure.
Dickson can, and Kathleen can. Yeah, so in Namibia, when you look at conservancy establishment, it was actually, when you look at, we started in 1998 with conservancies, and the strategy was actually to have them more closer to conservation areas, and that is protected areas or game reserves. And the reason for that was really to have a complement between protected areas and looking at the communal areas. And so you will see, it's a pity that I didn't show the Namibian map, that most of the conservancies, those 86 conservancies, half of those conservancies actually form a buffer around most of the protected areas in Namibia, or game reserves in Namibia. And so as a result, we have also seen that has forced landscape management for conservancies and protected areas. So there's co-management between the parks and the communities. We have what we call a parks and neighbors policy, where in Namibia, it is regarded that the parks will work very closely with their neighbors, and most of those neighbors are the conservancies, the communal conservancies, or will be the private farms that are bordering the conservancies. We had a drought now for more than 10 years. We just had very good rains for the first time in more than 10, in some areas, more than 12 years. And that is an indication that we were actually forced by climate change and by the drought to work together on those landscapes. So you'll see that from a climate change point of view, there's a lot of projects that are actually opening up much more bigger landscapes for conservation. And so these institutional mechanisms are being put together for them to meet together, plan together, have activities together. So it's something that I think for me that is working now in terms of opening up more landscapes for conservation. But we are also seeing after COVID that while we started having these great movements of landscapes, that it's starting again to shrink, because now land conversion into other land uses seems to be another challenge. And it always takes time to go back unless they see some incentives. So I agree with Kathleen that we really need to talk about the issue of diversification. For me, tourism will not come back in the way it was, and we need to think about moving ahead in conservation and try to protect what we have, how we are going to go around it. So I think it's lessons learned and being very adaptive as we go. Thanks.
Thank you, Maxi. We have time for another couple of questions. I don't know whether Dickson or Kathleen, you wanted to chime in on that particular point before we move on.
Yeah, I just wanted, first of all, to celebrate the good news that it has rained in some parts of Namibia. Yeah, always looking forward to hear that message. Yeah, indeed, the recognition even in Kenya that protected areas alone are not adequate and sufficient to cover habitat required by wildlife is really the driver of the Conservancy movement. And in Kenya, the Kenya Wildlife Service was and has always been the lead in establishment of conservancies and promoting community-based conservation. If you remember the map that I shared, you see that the green areas, which were the natural reserves, were generally the conservancies really built around those areas because the conservation area managers, the park managers, really see the value of wildlife going out and being able to come back safely. And so I think there is a strong link in that sense. I think in terms of how effective is that partnership, I think it varies a lot. Really depends on the motivation and interest of the protected area manager. And I think that there is a huge opportunity to really begin developing conservancy protected areas, reserves, joint management committees, so that there is a lot of synergy there. There could sometimes be cases of perceived competition, particularly when tourism is involved. But I think that the bigger gain is in consolidating and managing these areas jointly, and really the kind of models that institutional models and governance models that could be built for that to happen. I would say that that's still an area of growth, so that then we see protected area managers and those that are from the communities really working more closely together, and even the benefits of being accrued being shared more equitably. I think there is an area for improvement.
Thanks, Dickson. As we close out, I'll have a couple of quick questions, quick fire questions for you. In about 30 seconds, if you could, each maybe if you want to. I'll be interested to know what strategies you've engaged or engaging in involving youth or young people as part of the movement that you're running to increase ownership of land management and good strategies for land management in across the groups you're working with? How involved or not, and why not, if at all not? How well are you engaging the young people and the youth, or the next generation of landowners?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think it's a tough question. It's especially in the wake that you now, I'm not so sure about Kenya, around 40% unemployment in Southern Africa, and especially in my country. A lot of these youth ending up in rural areas where we have a lot of these programs going on. And that is my fear. How do we engage them in all the activities that we try to set up for, in conservation management. So from our side is that, and it's not just looking at youth, we're also looking at vulnerable communities, because after COVID, everybody now has become vulnerable in those areas. We're looking at women also. So all those vulnerable groups, we need to start engaging. But I think it's also an issue for us of reconnecting the youth in terms of what conservation, just basic, going back to our foundation as to what conservation is. A lot of our youth are urbanists, just like anywhere else in the world. They don't understand conservation anymore, and just rural life is very, yeah, it's something very foreign for them. And as an African, when you say these people coming from outside, like, no, we think all of Africa is rural. How is your youth not understanding what is wildlife or what is natural resources? This is happening because everybody else is moving into urban areas. But now we are seeing them coming back. And I see this as an opportunity and as a strategy to engage them in all the management structures. We are trying to engage them in our governance structures in conservancies. We are trying to create platforms for them to have a voice in terms of making decisions, but trying to mentor them as part of this process, because they need guidance as we go forward. And I must say, it is a challenge. It's not as easy, but we are trying to make sure that we mainstream a lot of our activities involving them. So that's what I can share, but it's not as easy as I actually alluded earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Dickson, do you have a quick reflection on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and partly because it's a really staring gap in the youth. Africa has a huge population of young people, a lot of them thinking urban, thinking technology, and so to what extent do we get the next generation to take over the management of these conservancies? Because if we fail to do that, then we'll be handing over to a generation that is not interested, and then that will be the end of all this effort. And so this is something that at KWC we do recognize a lot. We are fortunate in the country that we have the wildlife clubs, which is a network of youth involved in conservation within all the schools across the country, and though we do recognize that that is also not adequate, and so at KWC we've begun running a campaign called Wild About Life campaign, which basically takes the urban youth to meet the rural youth and have them experience a conservation area and meet those that are working there. And we've been very encouraged with the results and how these young people come back and say, wow, that was new, this was interesting. And I think the more we are able to do that across board, and the more funding we can access to be able to get these youth to visit, to engage through internship, is also going to be relatively important. And I think it's also that we have research and institutions that are engaging the youth in conducting research and surveys in these areas. Also within institute like what used to be the Kenya Wildlife Training Institute, now called the Wildlife Research Institute, which I sit in the board, and they are adjusting their programming to train more young people. More recently, we have even regional associations like the Northern Rangeland Trust having a program called Ujuzi Manyatani, which basically means skills within the villages, getting the young people to access skill developments and using those as entry points for conservation discussions. And schools like the Koyaki Guiding School, where we train young people to become safari guides, stand out as good examples to be replicated. And I think that the more we can tailor-made courses and institutions and curricula that provide information to the youth, and getting the youth to participate, even those that are remotely, rather located in urban areas, to create an opportunity for them to visit and experience these natural areas, the more there will be an understanding on the role of youth. And I think also within the land management entities, within the conservancies themselves, beginning to get the youth represented in boards, in committees, and creating jobs for them in the tourism industry and in conservation management really is going to be central. And I'm glad that you know, a lot of our job opportunities are actually available for the youth, but that, you know, is still fantastic. Inadequate.
Thank you so much. That's a really, really great answer. Thank you to both of you for that answer. I want to just round up and say thank you to Kathleen, Dickson, Maxi, for a wonderful, wonderful discussion, and I look forward to catching up with you again very soon. And thank you to the participants as well. And I'll just hand over to Jim to close it out.
This was really an excellent panel. I personally learned so much, and I'm very much looking forward to the results of the African Protected Areas Congress and what comes out of that, and to see the civic sector in conservation in Africa, which is really filling a very important gap when governments are strained just to meet daily needs of the citizenry. It's really important that you all continue your good work in the direction of 30 by 30 and beyond. So thank you so much for participating, Kiragu. Thank you for doing such a great job at organizing this. And we will follow this up with several more African webinars in the coming months. So everyone have a healthy and happy day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye soon. Bye.